The first time Claire Matthews felt the headache, she brushed it off as nothing. It had been a long day at work, and between balancing marketing reports and back-to-back meetings, a little tension in her temples seemed normal. She popped 2 aspirin, chugged a glass of water, and went to bed early. But by the next morning, the headache hadn't gone away. In fact, it had gotten worse. The pain wasn't a dull ache anymore, it had transformed into sharp, throbbing pulses that made her squint in the morning light. Claire frowned as she rubbed her temples, feeling a strange pressure behind her right eye. She groaned, dragging herself out of bed. Coffee, she muttered to herself. That was the solution to everything, wasn't it? A strong cup of black coffee and a hot shower would clear her head. But as soon as she stepped into the kitchen, something felt off. The air seemed thick, like the room was tilting ever so slightly. She had to grab the counter to steady herself. Her fingers tingled, just for a second, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. Maybe I'm dehydrated, she thought. Claire shook it off, made her coffee, and forced herself through her morning routine. By the time she reached her office in downtown Chicago, the headache had dulled, but there was still a lingering discomfort, like a storm brewing beneath her skull. She sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, trying to concentrate on the analytics report in front of her. But the numbers blurred. The words swam. It took longer than usual to form thoughts, and for the first time in her life, she struggled to type a simple email. A small ripple of unease ran through her. Was she coming down with something? Hey, Claire, you okay? Her coworker, Jenna, leaned against the doorway of her office. Claire blinked, snapping back to reality. Yeah, just a headache, she said, forcing a smile. Jenna studied her for a moment. You look pale. Maybe you should go home? Claire waved a hand dismissively. Nah, I'll be fine. Just need more coffee. But as the hours passed, the pain only got worse. It spread from her temple to the back of her skull, creeping down her neck like icy fingers. By the time 3 p.m. rolled around, she couldn't focus at all. The room was spinning, her vision slightly off-center. A strange metallic taste filled her mouth. That's when the nausea hit. Claire barely made it to the office restroom before she vomited. She clutched the sink, panting, her skin clammy. Something was wrong. She couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just a headache. And she had no idea that the real nightmare was just beginning. Claire sat on the cool tile floor of the office restroom, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The world tilted slightly as she pressed her forehead against the sink's edge. She had never felt anything like this before, a headache so intense it made her vomit, dizziness that felt like her balance had been stolen. For a moment, she considered calling an Uber and heading straight to the emergency room. But then the rational part of her brain took over. It's probably a migraine, she told herself. A bad one, sure, but nothing more than that. Taking slow, deep breaths, she pulled herself up and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked in the mirror, she was startled by how pale she appeared. Dark circles clung under her eyes, and her pupils looked strangely dilated. This is not normal. Claire grabbed her phone and texted her best friend, Rachel. Claire, hey, feeling weird. Bad headache, dizzy, just threw up. Think it's a migraine? Rachel's response was almost immediate. Rachel, that doesn't sound right. You never get migraines. You should see a doctor. Claire groaned. The last thing she wanted was to sit in an urgent care waiting room for hours. She'd had a stressful week, maybe her body was just reacting to it. Still, a tiny voice in her head whispered, what if it's something worse? She decided to finish the day at work but promised herself she'd stop at a pharmacy on the way home to pick up stronger painkillers. By the time she left the office, the world outside looked wrong. The sun had started to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the Chicago skyline, but something about it unsettled her. The buildings seemed taller than usual, stretching toward the sky in an unnatural way. The traffic lights looked too bright, their colors almost pulsing. Her fingers tingled again. This time, it lasted longer. Claire shook her head, trying to clear the haze in her mind. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe she was just imagining things. She stopped at a Walgreens near her apartment and grabbed a bottle of extra-strength ibuprofen. As she waited in line, she suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was irrational, but it was there, a deep, crawling fear that something terrible was about to happen. The cashier handed her the bag, and for a split second, her face seemed to distort. Claire gasped, stumbling backward. "What the hell?" she muttered. The cashier, a young guy with a bored expression, looked at her in confusion. You okay?" Claire blinked rapidly. The distortion was gone. The cashier looked completely normal again. "Why yeah," she stammered, forcing a laugh. "Just a rough day." She practically ran out of the store. By the time she got home, the headache was unbearable. The pain had burrowed deep into her skull, pulsating with each beat of her heart. She swallowed 3 ibuprofen pills, then collapsed onto the couch. Just sleep it off, she thought. I'll be fine in the morning. But that night, Claire had the worst dream of her life. In the dream, she was trapped in her apartment, but it wasn't her apartment. The walls pulsed like they were alive, breathing in and out with a slow, rhythmic motion. The windows were gone, replaced by endless darkness. And then, there was a whisper. A voice she didn't recognize, low and distorted, rasping directly into her ear. "It's inside you." Claire woke up screaming. Her head felt like it was splitting open. The pain was unbearable. And for the first time, she realized this wasn't just a headache. Something was very wrong. Claire sat up in bed, gasping for air. Sweat clung to her skin, and the headache, oh God, the headache, was worse than ever. It felt like something was pressing against the inside of her skull, trying to force its way out. She ran her hands through her damp hair, trying to steady her breathing. The dream still clung to her mind, lingering like a shadow in the corners of the room. The whisper had felt so real. "It's inside you." Her stomach twisted at the memory. What the hell did that mean? She stumbled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom, flipping on the light. The brightness sent a sharp, stabbing pain through her skull, and she winced, gripping the sink for support. When she looked into the mirror, a jolt of fear shot through her. Her right eye, something was wrong with it. The pupil was slightly larger than the left. Not by much, but enough that she noticed. And there was something else. A faint, dark vein stretched from the corner of her eye down toward her cheek. Her breath hitched. Had that been there before? No. She would have noticed it. Her fingers trembled as she touched the skin near her eye, pressing lightly. A sharp, icy sensation shot through her head, and she flinched back. Something was definitely wrong. She needed help. Grabbing her phone, she quickly searched for urgent care centers nearby. The closest one was just a few blocks away, open 24/7. She didn't even bother changing out of her sweatpants and hoodie. She threw on her sneakers and was out the door within minutes. The clinic's waiting room was nearly empty, save for an older man coughing into a tissue and a nurse typing on a computer behind the front desk. Claire approached the counter, swallowing against the nausea that hadn't left her since earlier. "Hi, I need to see a doctor," she said, her voice hoarse. The nurse glanced up, eyeing her with mild concern. "What are your symptoms?" "Really bad headache, dizziness, nausea. And my eye, something's wrong with it." The nurse's gaze flickered to her right eye, and for a split second, Claire swore she saw the woman's face pale. But then she smiled politely. "Fill this out, and we'll get you seen as soon as possible." Claire nodded, taking the clipboard. Her hands trembled as she filled out the form. When she returned it, the nurse immediately led her to an examination room. A few minutes later, a doctor entered, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Hayes and got straight to business. "Tell me exactly what's been going on," he said, shining a small flashlight into her eyes. Claire explained everything, the headache, the dizziness, the nausea, the strange sensations. She hesitated before mentioning the dream, worried it would make her sound paranoid. Dr. Hayes listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he took a step back and folded his arms. "I'd like to run some tests," he said. "The asymmetry in your pupils is concerning, and the symptoms you're describing, they don't quite add up to a typical migraine." Claire's pulse quickened. "What do you think it is?" The doctor hesitated. "I don't want to speculate just yet. Let's do a CT scan and get a better look at what's going on." A cold dread settled in Claire's stomach. A scan? That meant this could be something serious. As she followed a nurse down the hall toward the imaging room, the whisper from her dream echoed in her mind again. "It's inside you." And for the first time, she truly began to fear that it wasn't just a nightmare. Something was inside her. Something she couldn't explain. And she was running out of time to find out what it was. Claire lay on the cold table of the imaging room, staring at the ceiling as the CT scanner whirred around her. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the machine's hum. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to focus on anything but the growing terror in her chest. What if it's a brain tumor? What if it's an aneurysm? What if I never walk out of here? Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the machine powered down, and the technician helped her sit up. "All done," he said with a rehearsed smile. "The doctor will go over the results with you soon." Claire nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She returned to the exam room, gripping the armrests of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. When Dr. Hayes finally walked in, holding a manila folder with her scans, she knew something was wrong. His face had changed, no longer calm, no longer neutral. There was fear in his eyes. Her stomach dropped. What is it?" The doctor hesitated, flipping through the scan images. He inhaled deeply, choosing his words carefully. "Claire, we found something unusual." She felt her breath hitch. "Unusual how?" Dr. Hayes turned the monitor toward her and pointed to a dark mass near the base of her skull. "We originally thought it might be a tumor, but it's not behaving like one. It's not solid, it moves." Claire's entire body turned to ice. "Moves," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said gravely. "It's shifting. Almost as if it's alive." The room spun. Claire gripped the chair tighter. "That's impossible," she choked out. Dr. Hayes looked grim. "I thought so too. Until I saw this." He clicked to another scan image. This one sent a bolt of pure horror through Claire's chest. The dark mass wasn't just there. It had tendrils, thin, web-like filaments stretching out into her brain. And worse, in the last frame of the scan, it twitched. Claire's stomach lurched. She felt like she might vomit again. "What the hell is that?" she demanded. Dr. Hayes exhaled sharply. "I don't know." Claire's skin prickled with cold sweat. "Is it a parasite? A cyst? What?" "We need to do more tests," he said quickly. "I want to admit you overnight." "We need to." A sharp, searing pain exploded in Claire's head. She screamed, clutching her skull as white-hot agony ripped through her. The world blurred, distorted. Dr. Hayes' voice became an echo, distant and warped. Then, something whispered inside her mind. "You see me now." Claire's vision snapped into something else, something horrifying. The doctor's face melted into a grotesque, shifting mass of writhing tendrils. The walls of the room breathed, their edges pulsing. The fluorescent lights flickered, their glow twisting into unnatural shapes. And then, she saw it. In the reflection of the monitor, just behind her shoulder. A shadowy, pulsing figure with hollow, gleaming eyes, its form flickering in and out of existence. It was inside her. Watching. Waiting. And now, she knew. Claire let out a blood-curdling scream. Then, everything went black. Claire's mind swam in darkness. A void stretched endlessly around her, thick and suffocating. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was dead or trapped in some horrible, inescapable nightmare. Then, she heard it. The whisper. Low and ancient, slithering through her mind like a parasite. You are awake now. Claire's eyes snapped open. She wasn't in the hospital anymore. She was somewhere else. The room around her was vast and colorless, walls shifting like liquid, warping into impossible shapes. Everything pulsed with a slow, rhythmic motion, as if the place itself was breathing. She turned, her stomach lurching. And then she saw it. The thing from her nightmare. The thing from her brain scan. It stood across the room, towering and grotesque. Its form was shadowy, flickering in and out of visibility, like it wasn't fully part of this reality. Its hollow, gleaming eyes locked onto hers. And then, it moved. Claire recoiled as it slithered toward her, its form shifting unnaturally, like a mass of writhing limbs struggling to take shape. You were chosen, the voice whispered. But this time, she realized, it wasn't speaking aloud. It was inside her head. Claire clutched her skull, panic rising. Chosen for what? She demanded. The figure tilted its head, and suddenly, memories that weren't hers flooded her mind. Visions of others, people just like her, who had suffered from the same headaches, the same whispers, the same hallucinations. And every single one of them had disappeared. No one ever knew where they went. No one remembered them. They had been taken. Absorbed. Consumed. And now, it was her turn. No, Claire gasped, stumbling backward. No. This isn't real. The figure pulsed, its voice slithering through her consciousness. You are not sick. You are evolving. Her body convulsed. Pain erupted through every nerve, twisting her limbs, burning her veins. It felt as though something inside her was changing, rewriting her, reshaping her. And then, suddenly, she was back. Claire gasped, jerking upright. The hospital room reappeared around her, bright and sterile, but something was different. Dr. Hayes stood at the foot of her bed, watching her with wide, horrified eyes. Claire, he whispered. Oh my God. She looked down at her hands, but they weren't hers anymore. Her skin was darker, shifting like liquid. Her fingers had elongated, tapering into something not quite human. Her reflection in the room's glass window showed the truth. Her eyes had changed. Black. Hollow. Endless. And deep within her, the voice whispered once more. Welcome home.